Good morning to you.
Good morning. Good morning to you. What time is it in the UK?
8:08.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for being with us, Professor, and thank you to all of you who are on the call. Welcome to our very first webinar for our global series in 2022. We want to begin by acknowledging the owners of the lands from which we all come, their owners, elders past and present, and we also want to acknowledge the medicine keepers, the people who've brought these medicines through the ages, since the beginning of human civilizations, to be with us, to not only to help with our healing, but to help raise our consciousness throughout all this period of time in ancient indigenous cultures and religious communities, and many, many communities which still use these medicines and have since the beginning of time. We've just lost touch with some of those traditions, haven't we? So today we're going to show you a short video for those of you that are not familiar with MMA. And actually I might just have a quick show of hands just to see who's not been on one of our videos before. So if you've not been on one of our webinars, please put your hand up. There's quite a lot of new people. That's great. Welcome, welcome, welcome. And oh, a lot of people. Okay, that's a heck of a lot of people. So what we're going to do is we'll start off with just a short introductory video. And then we're going to do just a couple of short introductory slides. And then we're going to introduce David to present to you. You're welcome to put any questions into the chat throughout this webinar, and we may also get the chance for some of you to actually unmute yourselves and to ask David your question personally as well. But so please store up your questions, get them out there, and let's have a fantastic session. I think, you know, well over 400 people have registered for this event. So obviously a lot of people are going to watch the recording and some people will probably come on late. But now we'll play the video and then we'll be back with the presentation in 2 minutes.
Did you know that over 45% of Australians will experience mental illness in their lifetime? That's nearly half of us.
Everything feels flat and dry. I feel ashamed.
Mental ill health devastates lives and families and costs Australians around $60 billion a year. Research and treatment expenses continue to rise, yet rates of mental illness indicate that we're losing the battle. New approaches are urgently needed to address this immense suffering and cost. Psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy is currently being trialled worldwide and has demonstrated remarkable promise in treating depression, anxiety, addiction, and post-traumatic stress disorder, with new trials underway for treatment of dementia and anorexia. The treatment combines a short program of psychotherapy with just a few medicinal doses of psilocybin or MDMA. In the 1950s and 60s, psychedelic treatments had a major impact in psychiatry, and many considered it the next big thing in mental health treatment. But for political reasons, the Nixon administration criminalised the use of psychedelics and effectively stopped all research. That research has finally begun again. With proper clinical support, psychedelic treatments are safe and frequently lead to remission after only a short program, and even where current treatments have failed. Here at MindMedicine Australia, we believe everyone should have access to the best treatments for mental illness. We will seek to establish best practice in regulated psychedelic-assisted treatment. MindMedicine Australia is wholly focused on the clinical application of psychedelic medicines. We're preparing for change by developing therapist training, ethical guidelines, a centre of excellence in psychedelic medicine, educational material and events, and supporting clinical research. We're a small organisation doing big things, and we need your support. Please share this video and visit our website to support us and get involved.
Indeed. So please do share that. Ilan will put a link in the chat, Ilan, won't you? And we're now going to start our presentation. Here it is. And of course, this session is called Psychedelic Therapies from Past to Present with the inspirational Professor David Nutt. Just a reminder to all of you that we don't encourage or facilitate illegal use of psychedelics. Our focus is clinical, and we are recording this session and it will appear on our YouTube channel. Next slide, thank you. So we have this enormous and growing mental illness crisis. Many of the psychiatrists and doctors in Australia describe it as the shadow pandemic. And pre-COVID, we had 1 in 5 Australian adults with a mental illness. 1 in 8 were on antidepressants, including 1 in 4 Australians over the age of 55, and children as young as 4 being prescribed antidepressants and other psychiatric medications, which is obviously very troubling for a growing brain. But also what we're seeing now is we're seeing evidence that 4 in 5 Australians now are reporting poor mental health, and we're seeing this massive youth epidemic of suicide and self-harm all around Australia, and I think probably a lot of the Western world. And that is very sad, and there's just so much suffering which could be avoidable. So it's going to be really interesting to hear what David has to say about the progress of this movement, which is moving very fast. Ilan, next slide. The elephant in the room, of course, is the lack of innovation in treatments for mental illness. So there really has been no treatment innovation for 50 years. And you can see the elephant there trying to get the attention of the bureaucrats, politicians, and so on. And it's important to say that it doesn't matter how many more psychiatrists and therapists we train, or how many telehealth sessions we have, or how many patient access gateways we create. If we can't get to the root cause of a person's suffering, they're not going to get well, and they're not going to get out of the system. So if we move to the next slide, you'll see this illustrated here. So in the case of depression, only 30 to 35% of sufferers experience remission from existing treatments, which is mainly antidepressants or psychotherapy. And of course, the side effects are quite significant. They're hard to withdraw from. And in the case of post-traumatic stress disorder, remission rates are as low as 5%. More of the same is not going to solve the problem. Next slide. So my husband, Peter Hunt, and I set up MindMedicine Australia in early 2019. In fact, David and I were just commenting that this is actually the 3rd anniversary of MindMedicine Australia this week. And David was actually in Australia for the launch of MindMedicine Australia, spoke at the launch, which was a sellout event. And it was a wonderful launch to this charity. Well, we've been working very hard day and night on this big, hairy, audacious mission to expand the treatment options available to practitioners and their patients. And we're doing that through establishing safe and effective psychedelic treatments, really, to cure a range of mental illnesses and addiction. Our focus at the moment is on medicinal psilocybin and medicinal MDMA because they're most advanced in the trials around the world. However, we're also interested in other psychedelics, which are also being researched around the world, and David no doubt may mention some of those. And he'll probably mention some of the other conditions that are also being studied with these medicines. For us, success means that these therapies become an integral part of the mental health system. So if you go to a doctor, you're feeling anxious or sad or have trauma or whatever, or an addiction, the doctor will give you psychedelic-assisted therapies as one of the first-line treatments alongside pharmaceutical medications and psychotherapy, with full disclosure on the risks and benefits of all types of treatment. In addition, our goal is that these treatments will continue to achieve the high remission rates which they're achieving in all the trials around the world. An average remission rates at the moment between about 60 to 80% in 160 or more recent and current trials that are taking place, which is a heck of a lot better than the 10 or 5, 10% or 30%, which I showed you a moment ago. And of course, importantly, as a charity, we want to ensure that these treatments are available and accessible and affordable to all Australians, no matter where they're based or their financial circumstances. Next slide. So as I mentioned, medicinal psilocybin is being used primarily at the moment for depression. David will talk a lot about that, but also being trialled for OCD and addiction. And medicinal MDMA is being used extensively to treat PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and potentially addiction. The remarkable thing about these medicines is they only require 2 to 3 medicinal sessions, in contrast to for what many people is a lifetime daily capsule or more, multiple pharmaceuticals, and also regular counselling, whereas these treatments just require 2 to 3 medicinal sessions with a short course of psychotherapy for patients to become cured. They are not palliative treatments, they actually are about curing patients, getting them well, leading meaningful and happy lives. They're very safe in medically controlled environments and non-addictive. So with thousands of patients who've been trialled over the last decade or so, there has been no deaths and no serious adverse events. Both have been granted breakthrough therapy designation by the FDA, which is a very rare designation, which is only given to medicines that could be vastly superior to existing treatments. And they're used to fast track the approval process so that when the medicines go through the phase 3 trials, if those phase 3 trials bear up what has occurred in the phase 2 trials, the medicines become instantly prescribable. And MDMA is currently at that stage where it's in part 2 of the phase 3 trials. And I'm sure that David is going to talk a little bit, you're going to talk a bit about MDMA as well, aren't you, David?
Well, no, I thought you had another speaker doing that, but I can take it in questions if you like.
Yeah, no, well, we do of course have other speakers that talk a bit about MDMA, but it would be useful if you can. But we'll probably mention just the recent trials in a moment anyhow. So the next slide, Ilan. Look, I'm going to let David talk about what's happening in the brain because no one can do it like he can. David, you're going to show these circles later, aren't you?
They certainly will come.
Okay, I'm going to skip that slide, my favourite one. So here is the MAPS phase 3 trial. So I will just mention these. These were published in Nature Medicine Journal just a few months ago. Incredible results, really. 67% of participants who received 3 MDMA-assisted therapy sessions no longer qualified for a diagnosis of PTSD, and 88% experienced clinically meaningful reduction in symptoms. And it's important to bear in mind that these patients averaged 14 years of PTSD, each of them. And they had a whole range of different traumas, as you can see. Some of them had been in accidents, some of them had experienced abuse and sexual harm, some had developmental trauma. So these outcomes are really outstanding. They do expect that the remission rates in this trial could go up to 80% with further integration of the medicinal sessions. So David will talk, I'm sure, about the importance of integration and psychotherapy alongside the medicines, because that's what psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy is. It's the medicine alongside the therapy. And of course, the medicine opens a window for therapy to really be fast-tracked and help a patient to get better and get to the root cause of their suffering much more quickly. And then, of course, this Imperial College trial, I'm going to get of course, David will speak about that. So we'll move on to the next slide. So, what we're seeing around the world is these medicines are now also being trialled for dementia and early stage cognitive decline, anorexia and other eating disorders, obsessive compulsive disorder I mentioned earlier, a range of addictions, alcohol, nicotine, opioid, also being trialled for weight loss and fibromyalgia, and they're also there's some investigations starting to emerge for autism spectrum disorder, Parkinson's, and even schizophrenia. And we're seeing expanded access schemes and compassionate use schemes emerging around the world where patients are granted access to these treatments in clinical environments, so they never get to take the medicines home, of course. But working with trained therapists, they do get to be treated with these medicines and therapies. In Australia, we also have these approvals occurring through our Special Access Scheme B federally, but our states are still blocking the medicines from coming in to treat what are often suicidal patients, and that is a real travesty. So we're seeing psychiatrists and doctors with patients in Australia who are suicidal, who are suffering terribly. Some are veterans. We've had over 40 of them get these approvals federally, but they can't be treated. So all of us need to work collectively together to work out how we can ensure that the states actually recognise these as medicines, as they recognise morphine or heroin in clinical environments. And we need to always make a distinction between a drug that is used as a medicine and a drug that is used recreationally. Furthermore, MindMedicine Australia did work with the Australian government to unlock this $15 million towards clinical trials, which have just recently been announced. And we're rescheduling applications to the TGA at the end of this month to again seek rescheduling of these medicines from Schedule 9 to Schedule 8 controlled medicine, which is where they should be sitting. Furthermore, we're seeing Oregon, many states in the US, Canada and others actually legalizing psilocybin for therapeutic use. And that is a very good and positive sign. Next slide, Ilan. So finally, the strategy of MMA. Our goal is to build the ecosystem for these medicines to become available and accessible in the medical system in Australia. And we do that through 4 key strategic pillars. Educational events like these. So this is our global webinar series, but we also present webinars and our psychiatrists and psychologists and GPs present at clinics and hospitals and think tanks and political parties and conferences and events. So if you're on this call and you'd like to have a special presentation about these medicines, please reach out to us. We had a major international summit in November. David and many other leaders in the field spoke at that with over 1,000 delegates. We've also started state and regional chapters all over Australia and have over 30 of those to build groundswell awareness and educate local communities. And we have a major professional development program through our MindMedicine Institute. We have a 4-month part-time certificate in psychedelic assisted therapies, and David and world-class faculty teach that. And we have a number of other professional development programs, online short courses and so on. We also have ongoing engagement with a number of universities around Australia, and we're working on the preferred legal and ethical frameworks for these medicines. We have a harm reduction service, and we also are looking at the rescheduling of the medicines, as I mentioned before, the sourcing of the medicines, the manufacturing of the medicines in Australia, and the rollout of clinics. So we're doing a heck of a lot. We're very tired, but we get inspired by wonderful people like David and wonderful people like all of you on this call who are supporting us and helping us. Next slide, Ilan. So finally, before I introduce David, I just want to acknowledge that our webinars are free of charge, but we are a charity, and Peter and I, whilst being philanthropists, can't do this alone. And so I just want to encourage all of you, to whatever level you're capable, to support us as donors. We have ongoing donations available and one-off donations and all sorts of ways you can help us in kind as well. And we really encourage you to get involved and to support us in any way you can, because we are getting closer and closer to achieving the mission that we've set for ourselves. With that, I'm absolutely thrilled to introduce David to you. He is one of the legends in this field. He's really dedicated his life and his career to this work. He always says to me, my absolute dream is that I see all of these becoming prescribable and available before I die. Well, I hope it's a long time before you die, Dave.
I'll second that.
And also, I just want to also announce that we'll be bringing David to Australia in November. And so we'll be having some live events with him in Australia in November, and we'll invite you to those and keep you posted about them. Very excited about that. So with that, Professor David Nutt. Let's all give him a lovely Zoom clap.
Thank you very much. Well, it's good to be talking to your international or global team now. And let me just see if I can make this a little bit bigger.
Yeah, there's people from all over the world here today, David.
Yes.
I've seen them from, Darwin through to Hobart, through to Switzerland, all over the place, Shepparton, and yeah.
Yeah, it's impressive what you guys. So you better change the name to MindMedicine Globe, I guess. Anyway, let's enough of that. Just I do have a couple of declarations of interest that you need to know about. I do advise one company in the field of psilocybin for depression. That's Compass Pathways, and I do advise a company called Awaken that's interested in MDMA and ketamine therapy, but I'm not talking about that today. And this one, Psyched Wellness, which is interested in Amanita, which I will just briefly touch on. So I'm going to look back and look forward in terms of psychedelics. Looking back is very important because mostly we've ignored the past, and the past can tell us quite a lot about the value of these medicines, but also some of the errors and mistakes that we can avoid. So here are a range of popular, commonly used psychedelics, starting from the top left. That's mescaline from the peyote cactus, also, of course, from the San Pedro cactus. And there's one of 200 different species of magic mushrooms that make psilocybin. On the top right, there's ayahuasca, this remarkable discovery by the indigenous peoples of the Amazon that you can put together in a brew, 2 plants, one of which contains DMT, one of which contains the beta-carboline called harmaline. And the harmaline allows the DMT to be absorbed through the body without being broken down. So you have a drinkable form of DMT. So, and they were way ahead of modern pharmacologists in that sense. Now, all those top 3 psychedelic agents work on the serotonin system. The bottom right one is Amanita muscaris, which makes a GABA acting substance called muscimol, and that's been around in Northern Europe and Siberia for millennia. There's a little Roman mosaic to the right showing how you make your mushroom tea. Boil up some water and throw them in. And then on the left, we have morning glory, the seeds of which contain an ergot chemical. It's also made by the fungus called ergot, which grows on cereals. And the really most important image of all is the bottom left-hand one. And that shows the Greek god Demeter partaking of the Eleusinian mysteries. And these were celebrations of art and culture and dance and music that the Greeks engaged in when ergot started to grow on the cereals. They didn't realize it was a fungus. They thought it was a natural part of the plant, but they realized that it had very special effects, and they celebrated their mysteries using a combination of ergot with its psychedelic effects and alcohol with its socializing and inebriating effects. And these mysteries were profoundly important in the development of Greek thought, and arguably made a significant contribution to Greek cultures and the foundation of Greek civilization, in terms of not just art, but also in terms of constructs like mathematics, arithmetic, geometry, philosophy, and of course democracy. And you can sensibly argue that most Western cultures now are based on, or have their origins in Greek visions and writings, and therefore maybe psychedelics were the founding molecules of what Western culture is today. And of course, you could also argue similarly for Eastern cultures, drugs like cannabis and ephedra were probably very influential in the development of Hinduism. But if we fast forward now to the last century, the emergence of psychedelics into modern Western culture really came with the discovery of LSD by this man, Albert Hofmann. And he was aware of the fact that ergotamine was an effective medical agent. It was being used for many hundreds of years to stop women bleeding after childbirth, to constrict the uterus, and also as an anti-migraine agent. And he wanted to improve on ergot, or the acid version of ergot. And so he made a derivative called LSD, lysergic acid diethylamide, lysergic acid being ergot, an ergot-derived molecule. And of course, his accidental ingestion of it and the writing about it in terms of particularly his 10-minute cycle ride seeming to take 7 hours, which of course has given the name to Bicycle Day, the 20th of April, we became legend. And he was a great enthusiast for LSD, not just as a tool, but also as something to help himself. And he used it regularly, probably what we would now call a midi dose. And he lived to over 100. Here he is at 100 on his, sitting in his villa overlooking Lake Geneva. And the first British psychiatrist to take LSD was Joel Elkes in 1953, and he lived to 103. So the idea that these drugs somehow damage your brain and cause premature aging is probably already refuted by the very first people using them. But we'll come to the politics later. Because in those days, drug companies weren't so secretive, and because Hoffman was a very powerful campaigner for the value of LSD, his company Sandow made it available. And there you see a little box of LSD tablets. They also, a few years later, after Hoffman had worked out that psilocybin was very similar to LSD in terms of having psychedelic effects through the serotonin system, they also made psilocybin available. And there you see some psilocybin 2 milligram tablets. And these psychedelics were used for three purposes. They were used to model psychosis, to help people understand the nature and the causation of psychosis. And to some extent, we are still doing that a bit today, experimentally trying to look for new treatments for psychosis that will attenuate the effects, say, of psilocybin in normal healthy volunteers. It was used as self-experimentation by mental health professionals. Often early in their training, psychiatrists were given an LSD trip so that they would understand better what their patients were talking about when they complained of altered forms of consciousness. It was hoped it would generate more empathy with their patients. And many of them had profound experiences, which they can still recount today, even though they're mostly now in their late 70s. And then it was used in psychotherapy, and it was used in two sorts of psychotherapy. It was used in psychedelic psychotherapy, which is what we're mostly doing today, giving a big dose. There's a profound experience, an intense trip. And out of that trip, people come changed. They can throw off the shackles of their depression or their addiction, and then often live a life that's much freer from those constraints. And that was largely the American way. In the UK, we used what was called psycholytic psychotherapy, and these were lower doses. They were not microdoses. These were, I would call, a midi dose, say 10 milligrams of psilocybin, or perhaps 20, 25 micrograms of LSD. And these were given before each psychotherapy session, and they were given to break down the psychological resistance to therapy, and so to facilitate patients engaging in what in those days was largely analytical psychotherapy, with a view to accelerating their progress. And the UK was a leading centre for psychedelic research in those days. Here are two UK psychiatrists who had something to say about this topic. The top one, Ronnie Lang, the great anti-psychiatrist, was actually quite in favour of psychoanalysis and LSD. And he said this: advice for those wishing to become a psychoanalyst: read the works of Freud, undergo personal analysis, take LSD. And Humphrey Osmond, who was actually a British psychiatrist who moved to Canada, he was the guy that first gave LSD to Aldous Huxley. And he then went to the USA. And he said this: to sink in hell or soar angelic, you'll need a pinch of psychedelic. Well, in the 1950s, there were no other treatments in psychiatry. Chlorpromazine wasn't discovered till 52, 53. Imipramine as an antidepressant, not till 57. And that's why there was an enormous interest and enthusiasm, particularly for LSD. Sandow made it available to hundreds of psychiatrists around the world. The National Institute of Health in America funded up to 140 grants to study it. It was seen as the revolution in psychiatric treatment, but also in terms of understanding and manipulating and exploring the brain. So they funded 140 grants. That led to 1,000 clinical papers, 40,000 patients, 40 books, 6 international conferences. And after these drugs were banned in 1971 under the UN conventions, the data were pulled together by these two, Masters and Houston, who came to the conclusion that results were overwhelmingly positive, describing safe and effective treatments. And here are 4 overviews of the benefits and drawbacks of, again, mostly psychedelic sessions, mostly with LSD. And what you see here is that the patient numbers are enormous, thousands of patients often, and the outcomes are good, but really importantly, the negative consequences are very low. Look at rates of suicide, 0.2%, 0.04%, rates of psychosis, 0.2%. These outcomes are almost certainly better than what would have happened if people hadn't been treated at all. So yes, we can never say a drug is, or a treatment is free of adverse effects. That's even true for psychotherapy. But the reality is that psychedelic psychotherapy was very safe. And here's a lovely quote from one of these experts. Treatment with LSD is not without acute adverse reactions, but given adequate psychiatric supervision and proper conditions for its administration, the incidence of such reactions is not great. And Stan Groff was there at the beginning. He's still around now. He's subsequently pioneered holotropic breathwork as an alternative to psychedelics when these drugs were illegal. He said this: psychedelics used responsibly and with proper caution would be for psychiatry what the microscope is for biology and medicine, or the telescope is for astronomy. And I don't think any rational person would dispute that. But of course, they're banned, and they're still banned. LSD is illegal still in all the countries in the world that have signed up to the UN conventions, which is around about 200. And what's remarkable is that they were banned in the face of opposition from the most powerful man in America at the time, and the world probably, Bobby Kennedy, who would have been president if he hadn't been assassinated. And he said this to his bureaucrats, the drug enforcement people and the FDA. Why, if these LSD projects were worthwhile 6 months ago, come on, we spent billions of dollars researching them. Why aren't they worthwhile now? We keep on going around and around. If I could get a flat answer about that, I would be happy. Is there a misunderstanding about my question? And he knew he was being lied to by his administration, who wanted to ban this drug. And he didn't want it banned. And he said, I think perhaps we've lost sight of the fact that LSD can be very, very helpful in our society if used properly. And one of the reasons he said that, because his wife was actually having LSD therapy at the time, as were a lot of other people, including Cary Grant, who had quite a number of sessions to help him deal with the fact that he was abandoned on separate occasions completely for the rest of his life by both his mother and his father. And I'm going to argue that this is the worst censorship of research in the history of the world. For the last 50 years, psychedelics have been banned. They're still illegal at a federal level in every country in the world. And I would say that millions and millions of people have been denied access to what could be life-saving treatments just because of this absurd political ban. And the reason they were banned is because psychedelics were seen as fueling the anti-Vietnam War movement. and encouraging people to be more liberal and to vote against war. And these are the only drugs that have been banned because they changed political opinions. And that's why they were banned, and why they weren't even allowed to be medicines, because they were considered too dangerous in terms of their political power to even be allowed as medicines. It's an outrageous fact. And if you don't believe me, here's the data showing how the publications with LSD in blue and psilocybin in red peaked around about 1968, 67, 68. And then after the red arrow is the UN ban, obviously there were still data to be published for a few years, output stayed up, and then it collapsed. And there was an explicit desire by the UN and the US, and probably most countries in the world, to try to get people never to know that the psychedelics existed, to eliminate them from consciousness. And they almost succeeded. Look here, 2 years here, not a single publication on psilocybin. And the reasons for the collapse in output are two. Firstly, since this arrow here, the US government has not funded a single study on LSD. And only just a couple of months ago, for the first time, has funded one on psilocybin. And since the US government funds most of the biomedical research in the world, certainly in this field, there wasn't any money to do research. But on top of that, if you could get funding from charities, then the regulators made it impossible for you to get hold of the drug. So this was, if not de jure, it was de facto censorship of research. With, as I say, with the deliberate intent to eliminate knowledge of these drugs, which would have been such a sad loss to medicine. If you want to read more about it, I've written a couple of papers. There's one in Nature Reviews Neuroscience in 2013. There's this you have to pay for. This one's a freebie in PLOS Biology. Well, about 15 years ago, we started fighting back and working with the Beckley Foundation. Me and my PhD student at that time, Robin Carhart-Harris, decided it would be interesting to explore the nature of the psychedelic experience in the human brain. And we knew there were many serotonergic psychedelics. Like you can see, there's loads of them, 22 of them on this graph. And this graph shows the relationship between the affinity at the receptor, the 5-HT2A receptor, and the human potency. And very potent drugs like LSD use microgram doses. They have very high affinity. And mescaline, you need high milligram doses. It has low potency. And psilocybin's in the middle. And we decided to start working with psilocybin for a number of reasons. The first is it's very, very safe. We knew at that time that about 1 million young people in Britain were using magic mushrooms every year, and no one was coming to harm. And we knew that the trips were containable. They're relatively short-lived, certainly shorter lived than LSD. And the third reason was that no journalist or politician knows how to spell or say psilocybin, which means it's much harder for them to attack you publicly. LSD has got such a bad rap over the last 50 years that if you mention LSD to a politician, they immediately try to put you in prison. Now, where are these receptors that these psychedelic drugs work on? Well, the really interesting thing, and this is something that's fascinated me and Robin and the rest of my team for many years, is that these receptors are massively expressed in the human cortex, the high-level thinking part of the brain. Very low expressions in the middle brain or spinal cord, none in the cerebellum. But of particular importance is that the high expression is in the areas of the brain where we do the very high level human kind of thinking and planning and imagining. There's lower levels, for instance, in the sensory motor regions and in the visual cortex. And those regions of the brain where you have the highest density of these receptors, these are the regions of the brain which have most recently evolved. And these are the regions which the humans have the biggest volume of brain in. And that they're the regions, therefore, which really define the content and the capacity of human cognition. And some people believe that they're actually, these receptors have actually driven this massive evolution of human brain size. That's plausible, but can't be proven at present. So we did this very first experiment. This is now a sort of classic image. We took people who'd had psychedelic experiences, so they were comfortable being in a scanner and having psilocybin in the weird environment of an MRI scanner. We gave them psilocybin. In those days, we gave it intravenously because we couldn't afford enough of it to give it orally. It's 10 times more potent if you give it intravenously. So we did that. We gave them a little shot of psilocybin. And they had the full range of experiences. They had all the visuals. They had the sense of body dissolution and floating out of the scanner. And one bowed at the foot of God. They all came back. And then when we analyzed their data, we discovered to our amazement that the visuals weren't associated with any increase in activity in the visual cortex. In fact, there was nowhere was there any increased activity in the brain. These are fMRI images. For those of you who aren't familiar with this, blue means less. It means cold, it means less activity. And you can see that the activity was dampened down in the regions where there was the maximal number of these receptors in the posterior and anterior cingulate cortices. And also the thalamus, and that I think is a reflex. As these regions switch down, this switches off. Now, there were two pieces of insight which came from these early work with the fMRI studies. And these led us to move into the field of depression. Because I should say, when I started off doing psychedelic research, I was interested in knowing what psychedelics did and actually what the psychedelic state was. And I'd actually worked on these 5-HT2A receptors, well, 20 years previously. In the 1980s, I had explored their function by using an antagonist and blocking them to see what they did. And to our surprise, blocking them didn't do very much. It just increased slow wave sleep activity. So we couldn't really understand why the brain had so many of these receptors if by blocking them, you found very little impact. And obviously, the way to test what they did was to give the agonist, a psychedelic. And then having done that, we found this profoundly unexpected finding that these psychedelics, and we repeated the studies with DMT and LSD subsequently, switch off parts of the brain, they don't switch them on. And one of the regions of the brain that they switched off was this area here in the yellow circle, which is called the subgenual part of the medial prefrontal cortex. And when we saw that image, we realized that that switching off of this medial prefrontal region was something that had been reported by many different treatments of depression. SSRIs, CBT, sleep deprivation, ECT, even placebo. Helen Mayberg showed that when people get better from their depression with a placebo, there is an associated reduction in activity in this region of the brain. And we now know from her work to switch it off with deep brain stimulation, but also other imaging studies, that the subgenual cingulate cortex is a driver for depression. It seems to drive the negative thinking, the ruminations of depression. So we thought, wow, if we can turn it down with psilocybin, maybe psilocybin would be antidepressant too. And this is an example, by the way, of what we call translational medicine. You do a basic science, you discover something really interesting that may be relevant to medicine, and then you move into the clinic to test out, and that's what we did. But there was another finding which is perhaps even more pertinent to our understanding of how psychedelics work in mental illness, and it's this one here. So I want to talk you through it because it introduces the concept of the default mode network. And this has now become a very hot area of neuroscience, and it's called the default mode network because it's the network which is active when all the other networks are not active. So I'm going to activate your default mode network now. So what I'm going to do is, in a minute, when I tell you, you're going to close your eyes and I'm going to shut up. And so you're going to have peace and quiet. You're going to sit still and you're going to reflect on what you're planning to do after my talk. So do that now. Just close your eyes and just think about what your plans are for the rest of the day. Okay, now you can open your eyes again. Now, if I was scanning you, let's look at this image here in the middle. So this is a scan of the brain. Blue is less activity, red is more activity. This is front, this is back. If I was scanning you whilst you were just lying still, thinking about what you're going to do for the rest of the day, I would discover that most of the activity in the brain was in these four regions here, the anterior and posterior cingulate and these lateral parietal regions. And that's the default mode, because that's when the brain is doing things, when it's not doing other things. You've switched off here your motor sensory cortex, you switched off your auditory cortex because you weren't listening to anything, you switched off your visual cortex because you closed your eyes. So you dampen down the rest of the brain, and then you can focus on this DMN. And the DMN is where you encode your sense of self and where you do your thinking about your past, your present, and your future. Now, fascinatingly, psilocybin completely disrupts the default mode network. There is no network here, it's gone. And that accords exactly with people's sense of being atomized or being, their bodies being distorted, their bodies floating out into space, them being somewhere in another universe. Because your default mode is critical for encoding where you are and linking all your sensations to all your memories and thoughts and plans, etc. And this disruption of the default mode not only explains the phenomena, or many of the phenomena of the psychedelic experience, but also turns out to be hugely relevant to depression, because at the same time as we were publishing our data, this group were publishing a remarkable study showing that in depression, more of the brain is engaged in the default mode network than in healthy controls. So here you see healthy controls, the default mode network, the anterior cingulate, the posterior regions, these lateral parietal regions. But in depression, you see much, much more of the brain is synchronized when people are just sitting quietly thinking about themselves. And this is a remarkable finding for two reasons. The first, it explains why depressed people have so much trouble doing executive tasks or paying attention or remembering, because they've got much less brain available to do them, because there's so much of their brain is engaged in this self-referential thinking. And this bottom image is a fascinating one, because it shows there's a very clear relationship. The greater the rumination in depression, the greater the correlation of the prefrontal region, this medial prefrontal region, with the default mode. And this is the subgenual cingulate. This is the region that's driving this hyperconnectivity of the default mode. And of course, that all makes sense now, because what is depression? Depression is a disorder in which people ruminate incessantly about themselves, about mistakes they've made, about errors they've made, about ways they've embarrassed people, about uselessness and the useless things they've done. It's an internalizing disorder where, in which individuals get locked into maladaptive and often self-destructive forms of thinking. So we thought, well, if depression's a disorder of overactive default mode, and we can destroy the default mode, then maybe we can disrupt depression. And we were encouraged in this by two things. The first is that even though we were giving psilocybin to our volunteers in scanners, they often said afterwards, "Oh, I feel better, I feel clearer, I'm more in touch with the world. Everything seems brighter and more positive afterwards." But previous to our work, this group at Johns Hopkins, Ronan Griffiths, they had done a study in healthy middle-aged volunteers who were just interested in exploring something more about life. So they took these people and they gave them 25 milligrams of psilocybin, the same dose as we end up giving in our clinical trials as well. And many of these had profound experiences. 2/3 said this trip, just taking place in a medical setting, Johns Hopkins, was one of the 5 most profound, meaningful life experiences. And many of them have said that it's improved their quality of life for years afterwards. And we began to think, well, look, maybe this is some kind of antidepressant effect. So let's do a study in depression. And at that time, the British government's Medical Research Council had put out a call for a trial in resistant depression, new treatments. And we got the grant. It's the only time the government's ever given us any money. We turned down the next 5 grants, unfortunately. But anyway, they gave us this one. And then we had to go to ethics and ask permission to allow psilocybin to be used to people with treatment-resistant depression. And they said, no, it's far too dangerous. And we said, well, why? And they said, well, because it's a psychedelic, because it's a Schedule 1 drug. And we said, yeah, but 1 million young people are using it every weekend, with mushrooms, no one's dying. Well, why would depressed people be more vulnerable? And they said, nope, they just have to do a safety study. And at the 3rd time of sitting in this committee, I thought, well, we have to concede, because otherwise we won't be allowed to do anything. So the first study we did was a safety study. We gave psilocybin to patients with resistant depression, and the main outcome was whether they lived or died, and of course they all lived. And the secondary outcome was the psychological changes, which I'm going to show you in a minute. But that, in a way, was easier than getting the drug. Because of these international conventions, it took 30 months to get hold of the drug. Only one place in the world could make it. And then they had to get licenses, and then we had to get licenses to import it, and they had to get licenses to export it, etc. And then it took another 2 months to get regulatory approvals. So it cost 32 months of a 36-month grant just to comply with the regulations that say this is a very dangerous drug. And I had to put in a special safe into my office to hold the psilocybin. And I said, well, why can't I just hold it next to the heroin and fentanyl, which I research, which are way more valuable to drug users and way more dangerous? And they said, oh no, because they're Schedule 2 and this is Schedule 1, and Schedule 1 has to be held separately. So we've created this monster of drug prohibition, which not only serves to no purpose in terms of reducing use, but also massively adds to the cost of research. So it costs about £1,500 a dose, which is completely ridiculous. Anyway, we did the study. So in the end, we did 20 subjects, all with resistant depression. They'd all failed on 2 antidepressants. Some had failed on 10. They'd all failed on CBT. And they all got a bit better. And some of them got dramatically better within a day of the trip. They got better. We measured it a week and 2 weeks, etc. And here you see that this is the biggest improvement in depression for people with treatment resistant following a single dose of anything there's ever been. It's an absolutely massive halving of the depression scores. And some people are cured. If you get less than 5, you're healthy. And some people have stayed well for the 6 or 7 years since we did the study. Unfortunately, the majority, certainly 2/3, the depression has crept back. And it creeps back over a period of weeks and months. And I think that's very important, because it tells me that depression for many people is like the sort of normal base state of the brain. It's like the way the brain has become to work. And this is particularly, I think, true for people who've been depressed very early in life and who've been traumatized from childhood. It may be difficult to switch the brain to not being depressed, and we may have to give repeated treatments. But these patients who did really well, like this patient here now who's relapsed, he says, why can't I have another dose? And I say, you can't have another dose because it's illegal. And why is it illegal? Well, because the United Nations says it's a very dangerous drug, but it's cured me. I know, but I can't give it to you, because if I give you another dose, they'll put me in prison. So how do we explain this profound benefit, at least for weeks or months, in people with depression? And I want to show you this image, which Tanya's already alluded to, because this is an image of brain connectivity on the left-hand side in the normal state, on the right-hand side under psilocybin. And this left-hand image shows the statistical connections in the brain, in the normal brain before psilocybin. And you see most of the connectivity is around the edge. And we call this a small world brain. And that's why the brain is the most efficient computing machine on the universe. We know of anyway, certainly on the world. The brain is 10 times more efficient than any other human-made computer, because most of what it does is done very locally. It doesn't expend a lot of energy connecting across the brain. Of course, if your visual cortex sees a bus bearing down on you, you've got to move your legs to run. So there has to be cross-brain connectivity, but that is kept to a minimum to reduce energy waste. But this small word brain, this constraining of the brain just to essentially do what it's always done, I think is one of the reasons why people get locked into disorders like depression and addiction, because once they've started thinking those thoughts, it's not easy to bring other insights or other parts of the brain to bear on them. But under the psychedelic, connectivity is restored, and connectivity occurs right across the brain. And this amount of connectivity is what you see in babies and young children, that all their brain is capable of talking to all other parts of their brain. And the process of learning and development is to take this very hyper-connected brain and drive it into a state where it's got much less connectivity. And that serves some important purposes. That's how we basically do the same things time and time again. So we learn how to walk and run and to speak and to read, etc. You need to have a reliability and a consistency of what you do. But on the other hand, if you're doing something wrong, it can be difficult to disengage. So we think under psychedelics, people get better for two reasons. The first is that during the trip, they can make connections which they've not been allowed to make maybe for decades, and they can see things. They can see why they were depressed. They can see the traumas which led to them. I mean, one of our patients described vividly how in his trip, he saw his father abusing him. And he said, he could say, stop, it's over. You'll never do that again. And he was able to get closure and then move on with his life afterwards. He's not been able to do that before. He might not even have known that it actually had been, the trauma was the major reason of his depression. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is that you can, during this period of hyperconnectivity, you can begin to see other ways of thinking. You can begin to plan a life where you're free from the constraints of ruminations that you had before. So we think this opening up of the mind has two purposes. And it does change, psychedelics do change people's minds. So here's a nice piece of data. Before going into the study, our depressed patients had what we call pessimism bias. They see the world as a nasty, hostile, unpleasant place. Of course, they're right, it is. The world is a nasty place, but that doesn't help. Most of us have what we call optimism bias. We actually see the world as better than it is. The pessimism bias keeps you driving depressive thoughts. And after psilocybin treatment, well, they're no longer biased. They're no longer more pessimistic. They're not optimistic, unfortunately, but at least they're less pessimistic. And here's a very nice account from one of our patients. My outlook has changed significantly. I'm more aware now it's pointless to get wrapped up in endless negativity. I feel as if I've seen a much clearer picture. Now, I'd never heard of the Journal of Humanistic Psychology before I'd started this work, but Ros Watts, our lead therapist, wrote up the patient narratives from this study in this journal. And I have to say, it's one of the most beautiful, certainly the most beautiful paper I've ever written, and one of the most impressive. Here's another quote. A lot of our patients use the analogy of computers to explain how it felt to have their minds kind of reset, made more normal by psychedelics. It was like when you defrag the hard drive on your computer. I experienced blocks going into place, things being rearranged in my mind. I visualized that was all put in order, a beautiful experience with these gold blocks going into black drawers that would illuminate. And I thought, my brain is being defragged. How brilliant is that? My mind works differently now. I ruminate much less, and my thoughts feel ordered, contextualized. Rumination was like thoughts out of context, out of time. Now my thoughts feel like they make sense with context and logical flow. And as I say, many of our patients talk about defragging or reformatting a malignant or maladaptive computer as an analogy for the brain. So having done that, we wanted to ask two more important questions in depression. The first was what the brain mechanisms that explain this, and the second, are they different for other treatments? So we did this study, which is the escitalopram psilocybin comparison study. very difficult study to do, to blind properly. And the best we could do is this: basically, all the subjects, all the patients, were told they were going to get psilocybin, but some ended up getting a big dose, a trip, on 2 occasions, with placebo in between. And the others got a low dose, a 1 milligram dose, with escitalopram in between. And they all got exactly the same psychotherapy. So we were able to at least get an equal balance between the psychotherapy in both groups. But so the difference was 1 high dose psilocybin versus escitalopram. And we were interested in several variables. One was tolerability, and it turns out that both drugs are pretty tolerable. Marginal benefits for psilocybin in terms of less anxiety, less dry mouth. Oops. But the really interesting data, of course, are the clinical data. It wasn't powered to separate between the two, just to make a comparison. But in fact, it turned out that on almost every measure except one, the QIDS, psilocybin, the green bar, shows that psilocybin is better than escitalopram. And that's not just on the depression scores, but also on some other important scores: work and social functioning, flourishing, anxiety, well-being. Psilocybin was pretty effective and scored better than escitalopram. And it was particularly good at getting people into remission, getting people fully well. And here you see psilocybin here, escitalopram here. On all the measures, at least twice as many people got into remission with psilocybin than with escitalopram. So this was a very profound and very positive outcome. We also did 2 doses of the psychedelic to see if we could improve the outcome. You see here on the left-hand side, almost all the benefits in terms of well-being on the Warwick-Edinburgh scale were achieved after the first dose. Maybe some slight increase. The same is true for the depression reductions. Most of it comes in the first dose, possibly a little bit more. But we're interested to know if this second dose will prolong the effect. So that's we're still collecting those data now. You also know that escitalopram did very well. Normally, it would show a curve like this. The reason it did so well in the beginning is because, of course, there was a lot of psychotherapy, the preparation and the being with the person through the trip, even if it's a very low dose trip, not really a trip at all. And then the integration sessions, they're all very important in improving people's sense of well-being and mood. Now, we're not the only people that have done this work. You have studies going back 6-7 years now from Hopkins and New York University giving psilocybin to people with end-of-life anxiety and depression, where it helped them come to terms with they're going to die. This is a study last year of John Hopkins showing that people kept on the waiting list, their depression doesn't do very well. If you give them a dose of psilocybin, it does well, and they carry on doing well, and they can switch these over subsequently. There have been several studies in Brazil using ayahuasca, drinkable DMT for depression. But there have also, interestingly, studies from Hopkins showing you can help people get off smoking and alcoholism with Bogenschutz in New Mexico. And we're now doing studies in anorexia, OCD, and pain syndromes. And you might say, well, what have these all got in common? And I'm going to argue they're all what we call internalizing disorders. They're all disorders in which individuals get locked into self-referential circular loops of thinking, which they don't enjoy and actually often resist, but they can't break free of. And I think psychedelics will allow them to break free of that. Now, our work has spawned an enormous number. There are 40 psychedelic companies set up largely to target depression and related disorders. The one that's furthest along is Compass Pathways. And they basically replicated our study in resistant depression using a 1, a 10, and a 25 milligram dose in 3 different groups. And you can see here, you got a very similar curve to us, that the 25 milligram was significantly better than the 10, which was better than the 1. And you can see you have a significant benefit in terms of reduction of depressed mood that goes on for many weeks. And down here, you also see the proportion of people getting into remission is almost identical to us, about 25% on the address. So we're pretty sure now that this is a treatment which will be very useful for people who've failed to respond to other treatments. But the 25 milligram, the high dose, seems to be necessary for a good outcome. There are challenges, and for the sake of time, I'm not going to go through these, but there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of optimizing the dose and targeting the patient population. If you want to read more about the science, it's all here. You can read about where in the brain these receptors are on the neurons, and how perturbing those neurons changes the brain to produce this hyperconnected psychedelic state. But also, there's this very interesting new development, which is the discovery in animal studies that psychedelics increase the growth of dendrites and synapses on neurons. And this concept of neuroplasticity being facilitated by psychedelics is really important, because it helps explain why the insights that people can have during the trip can be laid down into long-term pathways for memory and behavioral change. I just want to finish by explaining, Imperial College ICT is trying to get me to update my computer now, which I don't want to do. So let's carry on with this. I want to explain to you how neuroscience really makes sense of not just the psychedelic experience, but also the medical benefits. I'm going to do it in the context of vision. You're probably all aware the brain is not actually a camera. When you see something, what actually happens is that the light from outside your eye goes into the retina. Your retina then decodes the different colors and the different intensities and the movement into different electrical impulses. They go up the optic nerve and they go in different parts of the brain. And your brain then reconstructs an image of what it thinks is out there. And the process of development over many, many years is for you learning that what your brain thinks is out there actually is out there. You test the theory that your brain creates. And if it's right, you remember. And if it's wrong, you generate a better theory. But sometimes this recreation can go wrong, because sometimes the brain can create what it wants to see rather than what's out there. And this ability of the brain to constrain what you see is one reason why the brain is an extremely efficient computer. But on the other hand, it also is very limiting, because the brain can get things wrong. And I want to use this quote from William Blake. He said that humans tend to see things through the narrow chinks of their cavern. They see the world in a very circumscribed way, unlike artists like he was, who tend to see things much broader. It's very focused. But for most of us, what we see is, we don't see very much, but what we see is pleasant. We've got blue sky, white clouds, etc. But in conditions like depression and addiction, what people see through the chinks of their cavern is either a miserable gray world or a love objects, the bottle or the syringe or the white powder. And using another quote from Blake, we can understand, I think, what goes on now, isn't it? Brains manacle people to this way of thinking, which is maladaptive and destructive. He said mind-forward manacles, and I think he's right. I think initially the mind starts it, but then the brain takes over. And breaking the brain is really challenging. And I think that's what psychedelics can do. And that's why people get better. And I'll leave you just with this quote, which I think is a very powerful one, not just for politics, but also for science and medicine. Those who cannot change their minds cannot change anything. And we've shown that psychedelics can change the minds of our patients, probably by changing their brain. And what we need to do now is change the public's mind to support making these drugs medicines, and hopefully get the politicians to change their minds, or at least become pragmatic about making them available for economic and humane reasons. And it is happening. Tanya mentioned Oregon. Here's the Economist now arguing the benefits of psychedelics is going to be tested in the Oregon initiative. This is a very profound time. We are at a real cusp of a fundamental change in our attitude to psychedelics, which hopefully will be fulfilled in the way we hope. I'll finish now by thanking the people who funded this research. I want to particularly mention this young man who committed suicide in his 20s, a great loss talented mathematician and physicist. And his family gave us his legacy to do the work, exploring the nature of escitalopram, or the comparison of escitalopram versus psilocybin in that study. So I'll finish now and I'll take questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David. Always totally inspiring. There are a lot of questions here, so I'm just going to, what I say, David, is I think we'll have to do the speedy questions, speedy answers, speed dating thing, which I know you love. So there's a question here. Hang on a minute. There's a question here. I mean, I think you've addressed this, but you might want to just mention briefly. I'm interested in hearing the professor's viewpoint on the preventative use of psychedelics with regards to mental illness. So as a prevention, I suppose, rather than as just a cure.
It's a really great question. And I think that's what Oregon are thinking. I think Oregon are thinking if people have experiences, they will end up with improved well-being, and that'll be protective. And I hope I hope is they will research it. The problem is, in the States now, with psychedelics, psilocybin, which is now decriminalized in many towns, and as in the whole of Oregon, it's still illegal under federal law. So the federal government will not fund research on outcomes, which is absolutely moronic. So we have to work out ways of getting other funding so that they can look at their outcomes. But yeah, I think it's very likely that well-being might be the better, more protective outcome. They make them, or maybe have the broader influence on societal depression than actually the treatment of depression itself. Yeah, good point.
Fantastic. And then there's a question here around your view on psychedelics for those who suffer from concussion, specifically persistent post-concussion syndrome.
Well, I can tell you we are doing a study, beginning a study in traumatic brain injury now, because it is conceivable that you might be able to kind of the neuroplasticity effects might actually be beneficial in states like that. So that's going to happen over the next few years. Watch this space. We're also, by the way, starting a study, and there'd be sub-psychedelic doses probably. We're starting a sub-psychedelic dose infusion of DMT for stroke to see if we can facilitate basically the brain relearning how to move.
I just love that. I remember the first time I saw those two circles, the diagrams, and I immediately thought, this has to be a potential cure for dementia and stroke. It was just like so clear. Yeah. So I think that's really exciting.
I'm not so sure about dementia, but but at least with stroke we can potentially, because we know how to make the brain relearn with stroke to something. We can facilitate.
But it's interesting because Johns Hopkins are doing that trial with early stage dementia. So
yes, it might. I think you're right. I think if it might slow. I'm perfectly happy that it might slow the onset of dementia. Absolutely. Yeah. I don't think it'll. I think once your brain is, dead, it's dead. But I don't think it'll bring people. It's not like, it's not like Lazarus. It won't bring people back from a state of dead brain. But on the other hand, it might slow down the decay. Yeah.
Question here from Sean. I know the focus of this talk is controlled use in psychedelic therapy. I'd like to ask David, as someone who's dealt extensively with the risks of different substances, to give his opinion on the fear of those substances leaking out of the therapy room and being used in uncontrolled settings. I'd also like to hear how he would schedule these substances. So, David, as you know, this is a very relevant question to our TGA submission, because indeed they did talk about the risks of diversion. And of course,
the risk of diversion is the smokescreen that's put up by administrators and by innovators and by doctors. We've had, in Britain, we have medical cannabis banned for years because they said it was going to be diverted. And I pointed out to them that the cannabis market in Britain is absolutely saturated, and also diverting it from medical use is ridiculous because it's far too expensive. It's much cheaper just to go and get it on the street. And the same
you can just go and pick a mushroom, right? So who was going to bother diverting this and potentially
precisely.
losing their medical license?
It's just an excuse. This is just one of the many straw men that they throw up just to try to deflect us from deflect the public from the truth, which is that these drugs are extraordinarily safe. They've been used for millennia to benefit. And it's the medical profession and politicians that are blocking access. And I can say that because I'm a doctor, and I actually find the medical profession's attitude is reprehensible for medical cannabis as well as psychedelics.
I totally agree. How would you schedule the substance? Like if you had the choice or any choice of any schedule, you know, available to you?
Oh, well, I've said repeatedly, any drug that is less harmful to the user than alcohol, and that definitely is unquestionably LSD, MDMA, and psilocybin, should be available in some kind of controlled fashion through head shops. Absolutely. You know, if you allow alcohol, you've got to allow these because they're way less harmful than alcohol. And so there would be an absolute net benefit to society if people switch from alcohol to these, even just partly.
Thank you for that. I'm just looking through the questions. Okay, here's one. Again, 3 questions here. Is there research happening in regards to mescaline and ayahuasca? So there is some.
So,
but
the ayahuasca, and there's been some nice brain imaging. I mean, there's imaging studies I showed with psilocybin have been replicated effectively by ayahuasca by Jordi Riba in Barcelona. And then there are the trials going on in Brazil, largely with ayahuasca for depression. And I think they'll be rolled out. It'll be rolled out in other disorders too. In terms of mescaline, there's a company called, which I'm also advising, actually I think it's called Neurotherapeutics now, that's trying to set up to do similar trials with mescaline. I mean, mescaline is quite a challenging drug to work with. I mean, potentially better in some ways, but long acting, also the slightly more complicated. It's not just a 2A agonist, it's also got noradrenaline, serotonin uptake effects, so it's a more complicated drug. So time will tell, but you know, we are beginning to ask that question, can we use it?
And there's a question, the same person actually, Benjamin's asking, given that hypnotherapists work with, you know, altered states of consciousness, wouldn't it make sense to add hypnotherapists to the list of potential psychedelic assisted therapists? And I would have to agree with you, Benjamin. And I think that if any hypnotherapists out there did apply for our training, I think there would be a fairly good rationale for including you. David, don't you agree?
Well, I was actually talking literally 2 weeks ago to the guys at King's College who are looking at the brain imaging after hypnosis and saying, you know, we could potentially, I think we're probably not a high dose, probably a midi dose of psilocybin might well be interesting to see if you could facilitate entry into and benefits from a hypnotic state. So I might persuade them to do that study at some point.
That sounds interesting.
Definitely hypnotherapists, I think why shouldn't they? They are exploring different forms of consciousness, and there is going to be some overlap.
And yes, Benjamin, there are people researching medical applications of microdosing psychedelics. David, did you want to comment on that at all? The microdosing?
Yeah, I think the answer is that currently microdosing is very difficult because even a microdose still is illegal as a macrodose. So there's very little research. It's another example of the censorship. But there are companies researching microdosing now. Single microdoses don't seem to do very much, but it might be over a period of weeks or months that you do get an effect. And I think the effect is likely to be resilient promoting rather than antidepressant. That would be my target indication for microdosing. And one of the interesting questions, if we get people well on a macrodose, could we keep them well on with repeated microdoses? That would be a lovely experiment to do. I hope someone at some point does it.
Yeah, I definitely think that's got a lot of legs. And then Steph says here, have you done any ketamine research? Well, yes, you mentioned that early on, didn't you?
Yeah, we're using ketamine clinically now to treat both depression and to treat addictions, to disrupt brain circuits in the same way. I mean, if you do EEG or MEG measurements or even fMRI measurements, ketamine is very similar in terms of the cortical disruption to psychedelics. The difference is you seem to have to give more doses to get people well in depression and possibly in addiction as well. And that's probably because it isn't as good at generating new synapses and neurons as the psychedelics probably.
Thank you for that. And then, of course, there's a question here about, can psychedelics potentially treat ADHD?
Yeah, that's a very open question at present. My own view is it probably not, but there is a group in Maastricht who are thinking that you can use MIDI doses, say 10 microgram doses of LSD. They've done a study showing it might improve attention in some people. So I think the jury's open. Let's see what happens. Let the trials decide.
Thank you. Would MDMA help generalized anxiety disorder? There's a question here.
MDMA seems to work best when there's something to work on. It facilitates psychotherapy. It allows people to access traumatic memories and essentially overcome them and reestablish a relationship with them. GAD tends to be a state of worry, which is often, rarely triggered by a particular event. So I'm not quite sure what you'd have to work, how you could work with someone with GAD. I suppose it might facilitate cognitive therapy for GAD. I'm not sure really.
So psilocybin could be more effective, I think, for generalized anxiety disorder. Don't you believe?
Yeah, I think there's an important distinction. Yeah, so just say a little bit more about that. So disrupting GAD is a cortical phenomenon. It's very high level. It's anterior frontal cortex, anterior cingulate. It's about people making these negative predictions about the future. That's what GAD is. It's thinking bad things are going to happen in the future. So you can disrupt cortical function very well with psychedelics. So it might well respond to those. Whereas MDMA works much deeper in the brain. It works in the amygdala, hippocampus. It's the emotional circuit, which is why it's particularly good in PTSD, because PTSD is a disorder of uncontrolled emotional reactivity.
That's very interesting. Again, this person says, if we have these studies showing the extent of how beneficial these psychedelics are in clinical therapies, what is your opinion in regards to government pushback?
Well, I think the reality is that all drug laws are political. Particularly the anti-psychedelic drug laws. I explained, very briefly, these are political decisions. Governments don't like to admit being wrong. And drug laws are one of the few areas where politicians do have they can still change, they can still make life difficult for us or good for us. And so politicians don't want to give up on the drug laws because it is one of the very few levers of power they have. So the answer is, I don't think we can approach them with rationality. We can't say it's stupid. The drug laws are stupid. They all know that, but they don't care. They have a role. What we need to do is get patients to say, you must change for our benefit. And then we need to put the economic argument, which is chronic depression, costs, each person with chronic depression costs the state hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pounds or dollars a year. If we can ameliorate that, we're going to save money.
Absolutely. So many questions here. Psychedelics, you mentioned, revive memories, just like the patient you mentioned who realized he was abused. However, I read about cases of memories of abuse which objectively had not happened. Would there be an explanation for such resurfacing of false or maybe symbolic memories?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it is something that we think a lot about. And yeah, we've actually dealt with that. You might want to see the film. The film is called Magic Medicine. It's available now on Netflix, and it looks at some patients of ours. And there's one example in that film. Someone does seem to develop a symbolic memory, which we dealt with, and that was a challenge. Yeah, and you're right, and it is it's a serious issue in terms of the possibility of generating false memories with accusations and that. So that's why we think this therapy needs to be done by people who've got experience and
it's the same with breath work, of course. I mean, you could get false memories coming up in breath work as well.
Well, you get false memories coming up in ordinary psychotherapy.
Well, that too. That's true. Question here. I'm wondering how the neurobiology of psychedelics can explain why some individuals experience their insights as more real than normal reality, or the really real truth.
Yeah, quite. Yeah, that's a great question. And that's because somewhere in each person's brain, there's something that calibrates what is real. And that's obviously, my view is that's an internal construct which can be disrupted in some people by psychedelics, so that they then they realize that actually reality is a scale and they were here, but you can actually get better reality over here, in the same way as mood can move up and down.
So that might stop some magical thinking, right?
Yeah, well, I can't prove it though, so
okay.
I'm not going to say you're wrong to think magically.
Tessa says, would you prescribe psilocybin to someone who's already on moderate dose of antidepressants such as fluoxetine, or do you wean off the antidepressants first?
Which we've always weaned off. This is an area of great debate at present. Do you need to wean off, not wean off? We always wean off because our experience is twofold, that people on don't have much of a trip. And also there is some evidence that the being on antidepressant can attenuate the long-term mood enhancement of psychedelics, and a little bit of evidence in our hands. It's not overwhelming evidence though, so it's very controversial at present, but clinically we've always weaned off to try to maximize the benefits. But I think at some stage in the next few years, some company's going to do the opposite. They're going to try, see what happens if you give it to people on SSRIs. It'll be interesting to see what happens.
Thank you. Look, I'm just going to run through, well, someone's saying, where's the best place to be a psychedelic assisted therapist? They were originally thinking about the
Oregon.
US, but maybe
Oregon.
then Oregon, there you go.
Well,
Makes
Oregon's
sense.
going to need, I mean, Oregon's, well, I don't know, people live in Oregon, but you must be talking about 20 million. It's going to need thousands of therapists to put out their mushroom clinics. So
Absolutely. And Rick
I'd definitely
Doblin,
head north.
and Rick Doblin says, you know, they want to train 10,000 therapists, or was it 25,000? I think 25,000 therapists in the next decade. So maybe go to the US. Though we're training a lot in Australia too. What ages are considered safe to use these medicines?
Yeah, well, that's a controversial thing. Most medicines are licensed for over 18s. I'm very well. So I think 18 upwards. Although I'm kind of, we're interested. I'm trying to set up a study in adolescents who self-harm with a MIDI dose, and seeing if we can help them reframe their.
Oh, that would be amazing.
Use of cutting and think differently about the need to cut. So that's a study I'm trying to develop at present. Yeah.
Awesome.
But you know, it's going to be like, you know, the hysteria about, you know, giving children drugs.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's necessary. It's going to be necessary because, you know, the closer you get to a child's suffering and trauma, the more they're going to lead a better life.
Well, indeed. This is a
inevitable.
really interesting point, whether you could actually take children who've been abused and help. I mean, that's wow. But I'm not a child psychiatrist, so I daren't go too far down that route because I don't quite know how.
But someone will. Someone will.
I hope so. I hope someone does.
So do I. Do you think the return, and I'm sorry that I'm rushing you, David, it's just that there's so many questions and there's some
I've got to stop as well because I got some dogs to feed or agitated.
No, it's I understand. Do you think the return of a patient's symptoms has to do with the return to their environment, e.g. to a lack of support and community resources and so on?
No, I think mostly it's the brain. I think there are factors. I mean, I think you're right. I mean, one of the problems with our studies is we didn't have the resources to keep them in therapy for longer than we
right. Yeah.
Just for it's conceivable if we had, you know, a year-long therapy. In fact, John Hopkins had just published a paper yesterday, the year outcome from their study, their waiting list study, and they did show good outcome. So I think you're right. Keeping people in therapy with lots of, you know, opportunities for both integration and group therapy will help. But I think for some people, the depression is just so deep-seated, it comes back. It's a bit like a cancer there. It keeps growing back. And we'll probably just keep cutting it down every few months. And eventually, hopefully, it may give up.
Thank you for that. Hi, Tony Shields. It seems the most conservative views on psychedelics are held by the medical profession and medical regulators. Given the hundreds of dollars spent educating these people to think scientifically, I think he means hundreds of thousands of dollars. Look at the evidence Why is this?
Oh, because the medical profession, the problem is the medical profession has been brainwashed to thinking that only RCTs, randomized controlled trials, are science. And they've completely missed the point that actually there's many other ways of getting evidence in medicine. But we have, and they've partly been, big pharma has kind of done it. The only people that can do big RCTs are big pharma. So we now have these monopolies which dictate medicine, and they've persuaded doctors and regulators that RCT is the only meaningful piece of data, which is of course ridiculous.
Crazy, especially with these medicines.
Well, that's right.
Impossible to create those sort of control groups. You know, and
so they will deny the evidence. They will say, until you do that. I mean, someone said to one of the regulators said, well, you'll have to give the psilocybin under anesthesia to prove it isn't all placebo. To which I said, well, show me any other treatment in medicine
Yeah.
that isn't largely, or at least 50% placebo. Even surgery placebo is important. But beyond that, why are you so anti the idea that people's minds might be amenable to it's a complex mixture of stigma and ignorance and prejudice.
No, that makes sense. What type of psychotherapy was used in the trials that you did at Imperial?
So our psychotherapists we use a kind of variant of acceptance and commitment therapy. It's about trying to understand the causes and trying to see what you can do about them, and then reconcile yourself. If you can't, obviously you can't change the past, but you can reconcile it. So getting closure to events in the past. That's what we've done. But the answer is, I don't know what the best is. No one knows what the best is.
Yeah.
I think we're pretty sure CBT isn't the best during the integration sessions, but I mean, even subsequently, people's brains might be more amenable to CBT.
Okay. And what are the rates of HPPD and psilocybin use, and what's the process in screening the risk?
Well, we don't have any HPPD in our study. We've done 200. We've done 100 patients, 200 volunteers, so it's 300 odd people. We've not had any. So the only people we exclude from our studies are, well, obviously we would exclude people who've had it in the past, but we haven't. I don't think anyone's tried. And people with history of psychosis or first-degree relatives of psychosis. We don't want to induce psychosis.
No, fair enough. And then question, absolutely, here about why does iboga have those anti-addictive qualities in treating,
Don't know. We're setting up a study to do the brain imaging of iboga, and then I'll be able to tell you if it's like psilocybin or LSD or DMT. I bet it isn't, but it might well perturb the circuits, enough to be anti-addictive as well.
Question here, as a harm reductionist, what do you think could be effective in dealing with abuse and ethics in underground therapy?
Well, I mean, abuse is an interesting problem, and that's why, much better to get it into the.
That's why we exist, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, and just to say one of the other things we do, we always film our sessions, just so if people say that, claim that something happened through some kind of some sort of delusional or some hallucination, we can say no, it didn't. You can actually prove that it actually the therapists weren't misbehaving, because there were incidents of that previously, and that's one of the justifications for banning these drugs, is that therapists misbehave. Again, completely fatuous, because you just ban the therapist, but it was just another excuse to kick the drugs.
David, I'm just going to ask you, I think, one more question here. What medications or other substances reactive with psilocybin?
So we don't give it to people who are on any blocker of the 5-HT2 receptors. So most antipsychotics, some antidepressants like trazodone or mirtazapine, they block the receptor completely, so that it doesn't work with them. And I say we also try to get people off SSRIs. We've never given it to anyone on a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. It'd probably be all right, but I'm not sure I would. I certainly give a low dose if that are going to do that, but that will have to be in a specialist center. Very few people use the MAOIs now.
And why psilocybin rather than LSD?
Because the trips are shorter lived. So there's, our oral trips are 4 to 5, 6 hours. You can do it in a day. If you do LSD, it's 12 hours. They've got to stay in a hospital overnight, so it quadruples the cost.
Yeah. And people are saying how upset they are to see Australia and the UK so far behind the US and other places. It is very sad, I must say, and we're doing everything we can, both David and all of his colleagues in the UK and all of us in Australia, to really advance our nations. It is really disturbing.
We will win, Tanya. We will win.
We will get there, everyone. Look, I think we should say a huge thank you to David. We've just got a couple more slides, but David, I'm conscious you want to go and feed your dog, so please take off, and we'll see you very soon. And everyone, we've just got a couple more slides that we'd love to share with you. Thank you. Big hugs, big applause for David, please, everyone. Ilan, if you could just pop the remaining slides on, that would be wonderful. And we'll just flip through these very quickly. So Tim Ferriss, who's the person who switched me onto these medicines, said he views the next 5 years as a golden window in which to really affect millions of lives with donations and support. So we really encourage that. Next slide. How can you help us? We're getting lots of people contacting us saying, how can they help? We have a great Learn section on our website. Talk to doctors, MPs, your local politicians, fundraise and donate, support us, attend our events, and so on. Continuing on, Ilan, next slide. This is the certificate in psychedelic assisted therapies. We encourage you, if you're therapists out there, and there's a lot on this call, to apply for the course. We have a nearly full 2 intakes at the moment, just commenced last week, and David gave the opening lecture at that. And our next intakes start in July. There's 2 intakes starting in July, so and they're getting fuller by the day, so hurry up. Next slide. And there's a very simple application process. Do join one of our chapters, or if there's not one near you, you might want to start one up, and we'd be happy to help you and resource you. Next slide for that. We also have this short online 4-week course available on demand. It's an excellent course. Next slide. We have some wonderful merch. We've got a fabulous Australia's first book of psychedelic healing stories featuring 53 Australians and their healing stories. We have MMA masks, mushroom gift cards, t-shirts, and more. Next slide, thank you. So, as I mentioned before, we are putting in rescheduling submissions again in the next couple of weeks, and we will reach out to all of you to ask your help to provide public support to those submissions. And we hope to get 5,000 supportive submissions for that application. Benjamin, I don't think there's a chapter around East Gippsland, but please reach out to us and we'd love to help you set one up. That would be wonderful. And next slide, Ilan. So these are the upcoming events that we have. So we have a Melbourne chapter event in our office next week. Next Thursday, we invite you to join us for that with a wonderful panel. We also have some other wonderful webinars coming up. People like Alberto Villalobos. Next slide, please, Ilan. People like Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, Dr. Wade Davis, Michael Winkelman, like an amazing, this is all on our website. So we'll, I think, stop the sharing now. And I just want to say a huge thank you to all of you. That was a definitely massive session. I think those questions could have gone on all night. Isn't David incredible? We're so lucky that he's been here with us. And I just want to thank all of you for your support. And if you enjoyed this session, please invite 2 or 3 people back to our next webinar, because this is like a good virus. We want to get this virus spreading as much as we can and make sure that people focus on the data and science behind these medicines, not the stigma and prejudice that has held them up from being available for such a long time. So with that, I just want to let you know that we will be sharing the recording and a thank you note with links in the next, probably tomorrow. And we'll look forward to hearing from all of you, and please help us and support us in any way that you can. And thank you all for everything, for being part of this mission. It means a lot to us, and we acknowledge each of you for what you're doing, either as therapists or consumers or the general public who's interested in this field. So thank you. Blessings. Namaste.